It didn't happen overnight. There was no single explosion, no dramatic speech that instantly shattered the illusion. Instead, it began quietly, almost invisibly, behind closed doors in Washington, in tense phone calls, in carefully worded statements that didn't quite say what they meant, but meant everything. For years, Donald Trump had dominated the political stage with an iron grip over his party. Loyalty wasn't just expected, it was demanded. And for a long time, the system held. Republicans fell in line, critics were pushed out, doubters stayed silent. But power, no matter how absolute it appears, always carries a hidden fragility. And now, that fragility is beginning to show, because something has changed, not in public, not yet at least, but inside the Republican Party itself. The same party that once rallied behind Trump is now fracturing. Senior figures, once fiercely loyal, are beginning to distance themselves. Private conversations are turning into public signals, and behind the scenes, a question that was once unthinkable is now being asked more openly. Has Trump become a liability? This is not just another political disagreement. This is something deeper, something structural. Because what we are witnessing is not just a clash of personalities. It's a collision between power and survival. For years, Trump operated as the center of gravity in American conservative politics. His influence reshaped elections, dictated messaging, and determined political careers. Entire campaigns were built not on policy, but on proximity to him. But that kind of centralized power creates a dangerous dependency. When everything revolves around one figure, the system becomes incredibly strong, until the moment it isn't. And now, cracks are forming. It started with whispers, concerns about electability, concerns about legal battles, concerns about long-term damage to the party's image. At first, these concerns were dismissed, brushed aside as media narratives or internal disagreements. But then something unusual began to happen. The whispers didn't fade, they multiplied. Governors, senators, donors, key pillars of political power began signaling unease, not loudly, not directly, but enough to create a shift in tone, a hesitation, a pause. And in politics, hesitation can be fatal. Because power doesn't just rely on authority, it relies on perception. And the perception is changing. The numbers, once a source of confidence, are now being scrutinized. Polls that once showed dominance are now showing volatility. Swing states, the very battlegrounds that decide elections, are becoming unpredictable. And behind every closed-door meeting, one reality is becoming harder to ignore. The stakes are too high. This isn't just about one man anymore. It's about control of Congress, the presidency, and the future direction of the United States itself. Because if Trump remains at the center and loses, the consequences won't just be personal. They will be systemic. And that's what's triggering the shift. Not ideology, not loyalty, but survival. Inside the GOP, a quiet calculation is underway. Can they win with him? Or are they heading toward a political collapse that could take years to recover from? This is the moment where power structures begin to realign, where allies start becoming skeptics, where silence turns into strategy, and where the unthinkable starts becoming inevitable. Because for the first time in years, the question is no longer whether Trump leads the Republican Party. The question is whether the Republican Party can survive him. And now, behind closed doors, in conversations the public isn't meant to hear, some are beginning to say it out loud. It may be time for him to step down. But how did it get to this point? What changed inside a political machine that once seemed unbreakable? And more importantly, what happens when a movement built around one man begins to turn against him? Because when that shift truly begins, it doesn't just reshape a party, it reshapes the entire political landscape. To understand why this moment is so dangerous, you have to understand the system that created it. Because what looks like a political crisis on the surface is actually the unraveling of something far more complex, a machine that was never supposed to depend on a single man. American political parties are not built on individuals. They are built on networks, donor networks, media ecosystems, ground operations, data infrastructure, legal teams, lobbying arms, state-level organizations, and above all, a delicate balance between ideology and electability. For decades, this system functioned with one core objective: win elections, maintain influence, and expand power. But when Donald Trump entered the scene, he didn't just join that system, he rewired it. Instead of adapting to the Republican Party adapted to him. Messaging shifted almost overnight. Traditional conservative policies were reshaped or abandoned entirely. The party's communication strategy became more aggressive, more centralized, and more dependent on a single voice. Trump wasn't just a leader, he became the signal, and everything else became the echo. At first, this transformation looked like a political breakthrough. Voter enthusiasm surged, media attention skyrocketed, campaign rallies turned into massive spectacles. Trump had tapped into something that traditional politicians couldn't replicate: a direct emotional connection with millions of voters. But that connection came with a hidden cost, because while Trump was strengthening his bond with the base, he was weakening the underlying structure of the party itself. The GOP's traditional power centers, policy think tanks, long-standing donors, institutional strategists were no longer driving the direction of the party. They were reacting to it, and slowly, quietly, they began losing control. This is where the system started to shift. Behind the scenes, a parallel power structure began to emerge. On one side, Trump's loyal base, amplified by alternative media networks, grassroots fundraising, and a highly mobilized voter bloc. On the other, the institutional Republican Party, still responsible for funding campaigns, managing elections, and maintaining long-term viability. For a while, these two forces coexisted, uneasily, but effectively, because as long as Trump was winning, or appeared capable of winning, the system held together. But political systems are not built for uncertainty. They are built for predictability, and unpredictability is exactly what began to grow. Legal challenges, investigations, controversies that refused to fade. Each one, individually, was survivable. But collectively, they created something far more dangerous: risk. Not just political risk, financial risk, reputational risk, systemic risk. Major donors, the financial backbone of any national campaign, began to hesitate. Funding strategies became more cautious. Some quietly redirected their support toward alternative candidates, hedging their bets against an uncertain future. At the same time, party strategists were facing a growing dilemma. Trump's influence guaranteed strong turnout from his base, but it also risked alienating key swing voters, the very voters needed to win national elections. And in modern American politics, elections are not won by the loudest voices. They are won in the margins. Suburbs, independents, undecided voters, the areas where intensity matters less, and perception matters more. This is where the system started to fracture. Because Trump's strength, his ability to dominate attention, was becoming a double-edged sword. Every headline he generated energized supporters, but it also mobilized opposition. Every rally boosted enthusiasm, but it also reinforced resistance. And in a tightly contested political landscape, that kind of polarization doesn't just cancel itself out, it amplifies risk. Inside the GOP, data analysts began seeing patterns they couldn't ignore. Electoral maps that once looked favorable were becoming uncertain. Districts that should have been safe were turning competitive. And suddenly the question wasn't just about winning, it was about losing, strategically. Because losing one election is recoverable, but losing control of the narrative, losing the confidence of donors, losing credibility with swing voters, that can take years, even decades, to rebuild. This is the part of the system most people never see. The quiet calculations, the internal models, the projections that never make headlines, but determine everything. And those calculations were starting to point in a troubling direction. Trump wasn't just a candidate anymore. He was becoming a variable the system couldn't control. And political systems do not tolerate what they cannot control. That's when the conversations began to change. Not publicly, but internally. Not about loyalty, but about viability. Because for the first time since Trump took over the party, a critical mass of decision makers started asking a question they had avoided for years. What if the very force that once made them powerful is now the thing putting everything at risk? And once that question enters the system, it doesn't go away. It spreads, quietly, relentlessly, until it forces a decision. And that's exactly where the GOP now finds itself, standing at a crossroads between loyalty and survival. But what happens when that internal conflict finally reaches the surface? Because when it doesn't stay contained. It spills out. And when it spills out, that's when the collapse begins. At first, it didn't look like a collapse. There were no dramatic walkouts, no official declarations, no single moment the public could point to and say, that's when everything fell apart. Instead, it began the way most political collapses do, with subtle shifts that slowly became impossible to ignore. A senator choosing their words more carefully in an interview, a governor declining to offer a full endorsement, a donor suddenly going silent. Individually, these moments meant nothing. Together, they meant everything. Because inside the Republican Party, the alignment that once defined Trump's dominance was beginning to fracture, not loudly, but structurally. And once a political structure starts to weaken, the collapse doesn't move in a straight line. It cascades. The first cracks appeared in places most people weren't watching: state-level races, local elections, key districts that historically leaned Republican, districts that should have been safe, were becoming battlegrounds. Candidates backed heavily by Donald Trump were underperforming expectations, not always losing, but not winning decisively either. And in politics, hesitation in victory can be just as alarming as defeat. Because it signals something deeper, a loss of momentum, party strategists began noticing a pattern. Trump's endorsement still carried weight, but it no longer guaranteed success. In some cases, it was even becoming a liability, particularly in competitive regions where moderate and independent voters held the balance of power. The data was clear, and data doesn't care about loyalty. It only reflects reality. Meanwhile, inside Washington, another layer of tension was building. Legislative priorities were stalling. Coordination between party leaders was becoming strained. Messaging, once tightly controlled, was now fragmented. Different factions of the GOP were no longer speaking with one voice. They were speaking in parallel narratives. One faction remained fully aligned with Trump, doubling down on his messaging, his strategy, his confrontational style. Another faction was beginning to pivot, not openly, not yet, but enough to signal distance. They started emphasizing policy over personality, stability over spectacle, electability over loyalty. And that subtle shift was the beginning of a much larger divide, because political parties are not designed to operate with competing identities. They require cohesion, a unified direction, and that cohesion was starting to break. At the same time, external pressure was intensifying. Media scrutiny increased. Investigations continued to dominate headlines. Every new development, whether proven or speculative, added another layer of uncertainty. And uncertainty is toxic to political systems because it disrupts planning, it delays decision-making, it forces leaders into reactive positions instead of strategic ones. For Republican donors and power brokers, this created a growing dilemma. Do they continue investing in a system centered around Trump, a system that still commands loyalty but carries increasing risk? Or do they begin shifting resources toward alternative figures, hoping to stabilize the party before it's too late? Some had already made their choice. Quietly, funding streams began to diversify. New candidates started receiving backing. Think tanks and policy groups began preparing for scenarios that just months earlier would have been considered unlikely. And inside the party, everyone could feel it. The shift, the hesitation, the beginning of something irreversible. Because once financial confidence starts to erode, the political structure follows. Campaigns become weaker. Messaging becomes inconsistent. Coordination breaks down. And that's when the collapse accelerates. But perhaps the most dangerous development wasn't happening in boardrooms or strategy meetings. It was happening among voters, because Trump's base remained strong, fiercely loyal, highly motivated, and deeply connected to him as a political figure. But outside that base, fatigue was growing. Independents were becoming harder to win over. Suburban voters, once critical to Republican victories, were becoming increasingly unpredictable. And in swing states, where elections are decided by razor-thin margins, that unpredictability was turning into a serious threat. The numbers told a story the party couldn't ignore. The coalition that once made Trump a winning force was no longer expanding. It was consolidating. And in national elections, consolidation without expansion is a losing strategy. This is the moment where political systems face their greatest test. Because the question is no longer about strength. It's about sustainability. Can the system continue operating under the same model when the conditions that made it successful no longer exist? For the GOP, the answer was becoming increasingly unclear. And that uncertainty was triggering something far more dangerous than opposition. It was triggering internal conflict. Leaders who once stood side by side were now navigating different strategies. Some believed doubling down on Trump was the only path forward, that his base was too powerful to abandon. Others believed the opposite, that clinging to him could lead to long-term electoral damage. And when a political party becomes divided on its core strategy, it stops functioning as a unified force. It becomes fragmented, reactive, vulnerable. This is how collapses truly begin. Not with a single failure, but with a breakdown of alignment. And now that breakdown was no longer hidden. It was starting to surface. In interviews, in campaign strategies, in the subtle but unmistakable distance growing between Trump and key figures within his own party. The illusion of unity was fading, and in its place, a new reality was emerging. A party caught between its past and its future, between loyalty and survival, between a figure who once defined its power and a system that now fears being defined by him. Because once that fear takes hold, the collapse doesn't just continue, it accelerates. And what comes next is where the consequences become impossible to contain. When political systems fracture, the consequences don't stay in politics. They spread, quietly at first, through markets, through boardrooms, through investment decisions that are made not on headlines, but on expectations. And what investors, corporations, and global partners began to see was not just political drama in Washington, but instability. Because the potential unraveling of a figure as dominant as Donald Trump doesn't just create uncertainty inside a party. It creates uncertainty across the entire system. Financial markets don't respond well to unpredictability. They price in risk, and suddenly, risk was everywhere. Election forecasts became volatile. Policy direction, once relatively clear under a unified Republican strategy, became uncertain. Would tax policies change? Would trade strategies shift? Would regulatory frameworks swing dramatically depending on who gained control? No one had clear answers. And when there are no answers, capital waits. Major investors began pulling back from long-term commitments tied to U.S. policy stability. Corporate leaders delayed expansion plans. International partners started recalibrating their expectations of American leadership. Because from the outside, this wasn't just a party disagreement. It looked like a system struggling to define its own direction. Inside the United States, the economic ripple effects were just as real. Campaign funding, a critical engine of political momentum, became fragmented. Instead of flowing decisively toward a single dominant figure, resources were now split across multiple potential candidates. That dilution weakened the overall force of the party. Less coordination, less clarity, more internal competition, and in a high-stakes election cycle, that fragmentation can be fatal. At the same time, industries closely tied to government policy, defense, energy, healthcare, began bracing for potential shifts. Lobbying efforts intensified as companies tried to position themselves for multiple possible outcomes. Because when political control is uncertain, influence becomes more expensive, more aggressive, more desperate. Meanwhile, small businesses and everyday Americans felt the tension in a different way. Not through policy changes, not yet, but through perception. Economic confidence is not just about numbers, it's about belief. And when people begin to sense instability at the top, that confidence starts to erode. Spending slows, hiring hesitates, decisions are delayed. It's subtle, but it's powerful. Because economies don't just run on money, they run on certainty. And certainty was becoming increasingly scarce. Globally, the implications were even larger. Allies who once relied on predictable U.S. leadership began reassessing their strategies. Trade partners questioned long-term agreements. Geopolitical rivals watched closely, not necessarily to intervene, but to understand how far the instability might go. Because when a dominant power shows signs of internal conflict, it changes the balance, not immediately, but gradually, and those gradual shifts can reshape the global order. Back in Washington, the pressure was reaching a breaking point. Republican leaders weren't just dealing with a political dilemma anymore. They were dealing with a cascading system of consequences, political, economic, and strategic, all feeding into one central question: how much longer can this continue? Because every day the uncertainty persisted, the cost increased, not just in polling numbers, but in influence, in credibility, in control. This is the moment where political calculations become urgent, where hesitation turns into action, where quiet conversations turn into direct confrontations, and that moment was approaching faster than anyone expected, because the system had reached a threshold, a point where maintaining the status quo was no longer the safer option, a point where doing nothing carried more risk than doing something drastic. And in political systems, when that threshold is crossed, decisions are made quickly, sometimes ruthlessly, because survival doesn't wait. It demands action, and that action would lead to the most dramatic turning point yet. Every political empire has a moment when the illusion of control breaks, not slowly, not subtly, but all at once. For Donald Trump, that moment didn't come from his opponents, it came from within. At first, it was still controlled, carefully worded statements, strategic leaks, anonymous sources hinting at concerns within the Republican Party. Publicly, leaders remained respectful, even supportive. But privately, the tone had changed completely. Meetings that once revolved around strategy were now dominated by contingency planning. What if Trump couldn't win? What if legal battles intensified? What if the party lost not just the presidency, but control of Congress as well? These weren't hypothetical questions anymore. They were urgent scenarios. And as those scenarios became more real, so did the pressure. Then came the shift that no one could ignore. Influential Republican figures, not outsiders, not critics, but insiders, began signaling something unprecedented: distance. Not outright rejection, not yet, but enough to send a message. Endorsements were delayed, appearances were reconsidered, language became cautious. And in politics, distance is a signal more powerful than words, because it tells everyone watching, donors, voters, strategists, that something has changed. And once that signal is visible, it spreads rapidly. Suddenly, what had been whispered behind closed doors began surfacing in public discourse. Questions about leadership, questions about strategy, questions about the future of the party itself. And then, the unthinkable crossed the line from speculation to reality. Calls, subtle at first, then increasingly direct, for Trump to step aside, not from opponents, but from within the Republican ecosystem. It wasn't framed as betrayal. It was framed as necessity, a strategic reset, a move to protect the party. But beneath that language was a much harsher truth. The system that once revolved around Trump was now preparing to move on from him. For Trump, this wasn't just political resistance. It was something far more personal. A challenge to the authority he had spent years consolidating, a signal that loyalty, the very foundation of his power, was no longer guaranteed. And in that moment, the dynamic shifted completely. Because power in politics doesn't disappear when someone loses an election. It disappears when the system stops believing in them. That was the turning point, the moment where control began to slip. Not publicly, not officially, but unmistakably. And once control begins to slip, it rarely comes back. What happens next will define more than just a political career. It will define the future of an entire party, and possibly the direction of the United States itself. Because the GOP now faces a decision that will shape its identity for years to come. Does it remain anchored to the force that transformed it, or does it attempt to rebuild a more traditional, more predictable structure? Neither path is easy. Staying with Trump means embracing the intensity, the loyalty, and the risks that come with it. Moving away means risking fragmentation, losing a base that has become deeply tied to him. This is the paradox of power. The very thing that makes a system strong can also make it fragile. And right now, that fragility is being tested in real time. If the party fractures, the consequences could extend far beyond one election cycle. New factions could emerge, voter coalitions could shift, political alliances could be rewritten. And in that kind of environment, predictability disappears, not just for politicians, but for the country as a whole, because stable governance depends on stable systems. And when those systems are in flux, everything becomes uncertain. For Trump, the road ahead is equally uncertain. He still commands loyalty. He still influences millions. But influence alone is not the same as control. And control is what determines outcomes. What we are witnessing is not just a political conflict, it is a transformation, a realignment of power. A test of whether a system built around one man can survive the moment when that man is no longer its center. History has shown these moments are never clean. They are messy, unpredictable, and often irreversible. Because once a system begins to move on, it rarely looks back. And that raises the final question. Is this the beginning of the end for Trump's dominance, or just the beginning of something even more unpredictable? Because in politics, endings are rarely simple. They are transitions, and sometimes those transitions reshape everything.